So I wanted to record this video with the concept, what would I do differently and what would I do the same if I could start again? So although I've had this amazing climbing career and I've done climbs that I'm really proud of, and I feel really lucky and grateful looking back on that. Of course, I'm not a perfect person and there's lots of things that I learned along the way, and I feel like if I could hop in a time machine, knowing what I know now, maybe there would be some things that I would do differently. But I also think there are things that I did which I would definitely keep the same, and I feel really lucky to sort of have made those decisions. The first thing that I would do differently is that I would get help sooner, which maybe sounds a bit weird, but basically it took me like 8 years of climbing professionally before I hired a coach or got someone to write me a training plan or just asked for any expert guidance at all. I think I missed a really good opportunity to learn more about physical training, about how to get stronger, how to get fitter. I missed opportunities to learn about injury prevention. I missed the opportunities to learn more about mindset and performance psychology. And basically I felt like I didn't invest in my climbing enough in an intentional way. I guess you might be asking why I didn't do those things. Maybe it seems obvious to some of you, but when I was younger, I didn't get paid very much as a professional climber. Compared to other sports, it's kind of laughable how much you get paid. And I always prioritized going on trips versus the money that I would have spent on coaches and things like that. But actually, I think it would have been a massive investment, not only in my personal climbing enjoyment and performance, but also my career as well. So the second thing that I would do differently is I would learn about fear management sooner. More specifically, I would learn about how fears are learned and how we unlearn fear. Now I think of myself as kind of an expert in that space. I've studied it a lot, and I've also worked with thousands of climbers in helping them manage their fear. But when I was younger, especially when I was a teenager, I went through a phase where I was really scared to fall. Top roping indoors felt super stressful for me, and I actually almost quit because of it. If I knew then what I now know, I now have a step-by-step process through which I could have overcome that probably pretty easily. I think it also just would have set me up a lot better for some of the climbing challenges that I did in my early career. Lots of people think that I'm this really bold climber, and I have been able to do some scary climbs, but I've also had many situations where I've not managed my fear as best as I could do. So yeah, definitely learning more about fear management sooner. So the third thing is that I wish I would have focused on physical training earlier in my climbing life. I think that, basic things like finger strength and power, I think if I'd focused on them earlier, they'd probably be bigger strengths for me now in my climbing, whereas I kind of feel like they're kind of weaknesses that I'm always kind of catching up with in a way. And another thing on the physical side of stuff is that I would definitely have learned more about injury prevention earlier on. So it's not necessarily just about being stronger, but also just about having a healthier body. In my 20s, I had like a 7-year undiagnosed labrum tear shoulder injury that really prevented me from climbing hard for a number of years and kind of set my climbing back a lot. And in that process, I learned a lot about my body. I learned a lot about shoulders and how the body works and how we prevent injuries, but it took me a long time, so I kind of just wish I'd learned that sooner. So the next thing I'd do differently is I would track my menstrual cycle earlier. So when I first started climbing, I was mostly climbing with men. No one talked about periods, no one talked about your cycle. The sort of evidence and research around tracking your menstrual cycle and matching it and syncing it with your training was very limited. No one really talked about it, so I kind of just ignored it. I was that person who would be surprised when they came on their period. The more I sort of hung out with other female climbers, and kind of the more it was talked about in sport in general, I started to track my cycle, and now it's a huge part of my climbing. Like any training plan that I have works with my cycle, but not just from the physical point of view, but also from the mental perspective. Like I feel like my comfort zone is much smaller when I have PMS symptoms. So I usually don't plan to like do a scary route during those 3 or 4 days before my period. And I often actually, like if I have an important climb that I want to do or an important trip I want to take, I'll actually kind of time it with my cycle. So I've gone from like not thinking about it at all to thinking about it a lot. It's definitely helped me a lot in my climbing, so I wish I would have done that sooner. The next thing I would do differently is I would learn to set goals sooner. I'm just generally not a very goal-oriented person. It's not kind of in my personality. But obviously goals are really helpful for lots of reasons. And I mean, it's kind of impressive in some ways that I managed to climb the hard routes that I climbed early on in my climbing without actually setting them as goals. Like, it might surprise you, but I literally did some of my hardest climbs just because my friends were trying them and I kind of happened to be there as well. And it wasn't until later that I became much more intentional and I started to go, okay, well, what are my weaknesses in my climbing? How do I want to expand myself as a climber? And then I would set goals and much more intentionally, and I got a lot out of that. When I didn't have goals, I kind of drifted around and it was hard to kind of track my progression and track my learning as a climber. Whereas when I started to set goals, it kind of directed a lot of my attention, directed my training, directed my energy, and definitely made me more motivated. I wouldn't want to be someone who has goals on the horizon all the time, but I think a balance of kind of intuitive climbing for fun and setting big goals really works well for me. So the next thing I would do differently is I would work on having a healthy attachment to climbing all the time, and I think that's something that I'm very aware of now after I've done a lot of work on myself in terms of mental training. I'm always looking to have a healthy relationship with climbing, a healthy attachment to climbing, which basically means that you're not using climbing in this anxious way, and more specifically not using achievement to kind of feel better about myself. I think what that really boils down to is not having your self-worth and how you see yourself connected or dependent on your performance as a climber. I've coached so many people who are really stuck in this cycle of feeling bad about themselves until they climb something hard, and I definitely have fallen into that trap a bit in the past myself. Yeah, it's not a beneficial mindset on any level. You don't feel good about yourself, but you also don't climb well because there's too much pressure on your performance, and your performance becomes very negative and you don't enjoy it as much. So if I have a period where I don't perform super well, it's not the end of the world. To say it simply, that is something that I wish I worked on throughout my whole climbing life and not just in the past few years. So one of the reasons why I like this exercise is that when I do reflect on this, I realise that there is so much I'd keep the same. So one thing I definitely keep the same is valuing of climbing partners. It's probably something I could have done more of, but I do think that over my climbing life, I've climbed with lots of different people and I've learned a lot from them. And I've also climbed with people from different parts of the world. I've travelled quite a lot, and there's definitely something to be learned by teaming up with people from different climbing communities who have different experiences from you as a climber. It's easy to kind of focus on what you've done, but in the end, I think so much of the time it's actually who you've done it with and how you share those experiences. You know, they just wouldn't be as meaningful at all if you'd done them on your own. So yeah, climbing partnerships are massive. The next thing that I would keep the same is having a positive metric of success and failure. So what I mean by that is it's really easy as climbers to slip into this really black and white way of conceptualizing success and failure. So, you know, we might think of succeeding as getting to the top, of doing the climb clean, and failing, falling off. But from really early on, and I have my dad to thank for this, he instilled in me this idea that actually if you're getting to the top of every climb, if you're doing every climb easily, then that's actually failure because you're not challenging yourself right, you're not actually pushing yourself to your limit. So from a very early age, like the aim for me was to get on climbs where there was like a 50-50 chance of whether I'd get to the top or not. I'm really grateful that my dad gave me that from a young age because I think so many people get the opposite. You know, they're told over and over again that if you fall off, you failed. And you know, if you get to the top of everything, it's kind of like this full points score or whatever. So it sounds like totally flipping it on its head, but it works really well because you really can't progress or learn in an optimal way if you're not pushing yourself to at least near your limit as a climber. The next thing I would keep the same that's been massively important to me as a climber, but now weirdly I've ended up coaching people in this space, is learning to fall early on. Again, I got this from my dad, and it's closely related to the previous point about falling not actually being failing. We also built that into climbing. You know, I practiced for falls early on. I was very aware of how my fear of falling would affect my climbing. And although I didn't have great sense of how you go about unlearning some of those fears, at least I did know how to fall from early on, and I could see that that was an essential part of climbing. Another thing I would keep the same is that I traveled a lot in my early climbing life, and that gave me a lot of experience climbing with different people from around the world, but I think most importantly, it gave me experience in lots of different climbing styles. I had videos of Lynn Hill climbing in Yosemite, and I just knew I really wanted to go. So I went when I was 18, and crack climbing was really difficult for me at first and completely bashed my ego. But you know, I stuck at it, and now I'm really grateful because now I feel like I'm a competent enough crack climber, and that's been really helpful for a lot of the different things that I've wanted to do in my climbing life. So yeah, just kind of focusing on being a well-rounded climber by traveling to different places and climbing different styles. Yeah, it's definitely something I would keep the same. Another thing I keep the same is, although I don't think I'm actually well suited to be a competitor as an adult, I think as a young person it gave me some really good experiences. One of them was learning really early on how to have a healthy competitive mindset. So I met a lot of other young climbers when I was a competitor, and I had to learn how to be their friends and be psyched for them when they beat me, and to not be boastful when I beat them. And I just think that there's some like great social lessons in being a competitor when you're younger. All right, I hope you found those things interesting. I felt on a personal level that they were interesting for me. I think one of the takeaways for me is that even though there's kind of this reasonably long list of things that I would do differently, in some ways I'm kind of fond of those mistakes, if you want to call them mistakes, because they're also the things that put me on this path and kind of made me who I am and the climber that I am. And if you actually could get in a time machine and go back, I don't think I would, because of course you don't know what would happen if you did do those things differently. In some ways, you know, this is a kind of reflection looking back, but I think the main thing is, what are you going to do looking forward? You know, I'm about to have a baby. When I come back to climbing, what are some of the things that I really want to focus on? What are some of the things that I might let go? So I think it's definitely more useful from a kind of, instead of having these regrets, thinking about it in terms of like, okay, well, how will I use this information to do things differently looking forward? It's very easy to not be very intentional in your climbing and in your life, and kind of just drift along and not really ask yourself the questions of like, okay, well, what do I want to get out of my climbing? What kind of climber do I want to be? What do I want to learn? How do I want to grow? Could my experience be more positive? Could I improve in certain ways? When you ask yourself those questions, you're being intentional, and then you change your behavior, or make plans as a result of that. But of course you can take that too far and you can become really anxiously attached to climbing, and you can start to worry about it, and you can, overthink everything. So I think the main takeaway for me is like trying to strike that happy medium of being intentional, but also not being anxiously attached to your climbing, even though it is something that matters a lot to you. Hey guys, if you found this video interesting and you'd like to learn how to improve your performance and enjoyment while climbing, check out the link in the description and I'll show you exactly how to do that.